Hello and welcome to this week's episode of Did Shakespeare. My name is Cassidy Cash. There are 5 properties owned by Shakespeare Birthplace Trust in Stratford-upon-Avon, but how many of those properties were actually owned by William Shakespeare himself? Today we'll take a look at the different properties available for visiting at Shakespeare Birthplace Trust and ask the question, did Shakespeare own a house? Shakespeare did indeed own a house. As it happens, he owned 2 houses during his lifetime, and today we're going to look at both of them. The first house that Shakespeare owned was his birthplace. Now, obviously, he was a grown man by the time he owned it, but it is found on Henley Street in Stratford-upon-Avon. It's still standing, and you can visit it today. They have preserved it, including the room upstairs where William Shakespeare is thought to have been born. The house is pretty simple. But for the late 16th century, it was a pretty substantial dwelling and was an honorable place to live for John Shakespeare and his family. William Shakespeare's father, John Shakespeare, ran a business out of the home. So it's divided in half to where part of the business or part of the house was used for his business and part of the house was where the family lived. Despite John Shakespeare going through a long string of very difficult financial times, they did manage to hang on to their home, and it would stay in the Shakespeare family until John Shakespeare died and passed the house to William. By the time William Shakespeare inherited his birthplace, he was already living at New Place in Stratford with his wife and children, and so he didn't need this home for his private residence. He rented the place out, and it became the Swan and Maidenhead Inn. There was a small cottage built onto the side of the house later that was used as a residence. The small house off to the side, which is attached to Shakespeare's birthplace, would actually go on to be the residence of Shakespeare's sister, Joan. She would outlive her older brother, and by the time Shakespeare died in 1616, she was the resident of that extra little space. It's actually known as Joan Hart's Cottage today. Once all of the family inheritances ran out, remember Elizabeth Nash was Shakespeare's granddaughter, and she didn't have any children. So once it tapered out and there were no more Shakespeares to pass the house on to, the ownership of the house came up for sale. It had fallen into disrepair. No one was really taking care of it. And some famous literary minds found out that it was still there and felt it was worth preserving. People like Isaac Watts, Charles Dickens, Walter Scott, and Thomas Carlyle were among the people who visited, and their autographs are still there on the walls and windows of the birthplace. And there's a guest registry book of other literary minds who visited Shakespeare's birthplace, like Lord Byron, Alfred Lord Tennyson, John Keats, and William Thackeray. Interest in the property and taking care of it built to such a degree that the American showman that those of us in the U.S. will recognize, P.T. Barnum, half of the Barnum and Bailey circus duo, proposed buying the birthplace and was going to move it to the U.S. brick by brick. Well, a bunch of people in the U.K. did not want Shakespeare's birthplace to be moved out of England, and so they gathered together and formed a committee that included Charles Dickens to raise the money to preserve Shakespeare's birthplace. Once they had raised the money to preserve the birthplace, they owned it and they rebuilt it and reestablished it. This was the establishment of the Shakespeare Birthplace Trust, which still exists today. Back then, it was known as the Shakespeare Birthday Committee, and they have changed their name to become Shakespeare Birthplace Trust. It was actually an act of Parliament that changed their name. But today, Shakespeare Birthplace Trust does own Shakespeare's birthplace, and you can visit it there today. So that's the first house that Shakespeare owned. The second house was the one we mentioned called New Place, and Shakespeare bought this house in 1597. In 1597, Shakespeare was 33 years old. He had established himself as a playwright in London. He had already written the Henry VI Part 1, and he had already written that tetralogy, which launched him into stardom. He was very popular, was doing very well, had plenty of money, and he came back to Stratford and bought the second largest house in the town for himself and his family. That house was called New Place. New Place would be the home where Shakespeare and Anne would raise their children, and it would be the place where their grandchildren would return to. When he first bought the house, it was actually embattled in a great legal turmoil, and the ownership of the house was under contention because William Shakespeare, bought it from the son of a man who owned the property. After Shakespeare bought it, it came to light that the son had actually murdered his father. And so there was a huge legal battle over him being tried for murder. And it resulted in the forfeiture of the properties, and the ownership was going back to the original man. And the sale was considered, it was contested whether or not he even had the right to sell the property because of the murder. And all of this was a great big kerfuffle. But William Shakespeare was able, after several legal roundabouts, to negotiate a sale firmly and concretely, absolutely, that it belonged to him and his family. But that was not the end of the drama and turmoil with New Place. It seemed to follow this property throughout the rest of its existence, because after Elizabeth Nash died, the property's ownership went to John Clopton. And John Clopton owned it and did massive renovations, changing it completely from what it was when William Shakespeare had lived there. Then again, ownership changed in 1756 to the Reverend Gastrell. And the Reverend Gastrell was a splenetic sort of man, to coin a Shakespeare phrase, and he did not like all of the Shakespeare visitors that wanted to come and see his property because it had once belonged to William Shakespeare. He got mad at all of the fans who would come there and want to see his establishment. And he got so mad that he went outside and tore up a mulberry tree that had been planted in the yard that was supposedly planted there by William Shakespeare. Well, the townspeople were so upset that he had destroyed this mulberry tree that William Shakespeare himself had planted, obviously a great tourist draw for the town, that they busted the windows on Gastrell's home, and Gastrell retaliated by completely demolishing his own home. To me, that seems very extreme, and the townspeople didn't seem to care for it either, because they completely ran Gastrell out of town and he was forced to leave and never come back. And that's why when you visit Shakespeare Birthplace Trust today, the building of New Place is not there, but Shakespeare Birthplace Trust does own the grounds, and they own Thomas Nash's house there nearby, which was next door when Elizabeth Nash, Shakespeare's granddaughter, lived there. They owned both properties. So Shakespeare Birthplace Trust does own the entire estate there, but there is no building, and that's why, because Gastrell completely tore it down when he just went nuts. So the answer to this week's question is yes, William Shakespeare did own a house. He owned two houses, Shakespeare's Birthplace and New Place. That's it for this week here at Did Shakespeare. I'm Cassidy Cash, and I hope you learned something new about the Bard. If you liked this video, please hit like and subscribe. As Shakespeareans, you know we love our friends. So please hit subscribe and become our friend, and I'll see you next week. Some announcements and things I referenced in this video. We will be taking a trip to Stratford-upon-Avon and London next September in 2019. If you, your class, or your book club would be interested in traveling with us to walk through Shakespeare's Birthplace Trust and add your name alongside Lord Byron and Alfred Lord Tennyson in the registry book there, you can come with us. Visit CassidyCash.com/travel Shakespeare for more information.